Thank you all for attending this opening round. Beautiful place. We're going to talk about a horrific topic. Large-scale conventional war is raging again on our European continent. The war has already claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, and the war's end is not yet in sight. What transpires in Ukraine is a war that many believe to be long past. We had become more advanced, more civilized. We had left such wars behind. And then the war did happen. And if it shows one thing, it shows that war, including interstate war, is here to stay, at least for now. I would submit that the Russia-Ukraine war is pivotal because for many of us here in Europe, it forces a fundamental rethink as to what war is, why it is fought, and how it is fought. It's interesting because if you look at the war, it blends both enduring features and new features in war. We see battle clouds created by constellations of drones and satellites that super empowered individuals can turn on and off. We see the large-scale deployment of robots and autonomous systems. And if you speak to Ukrainians off the record, you hear them hinting at the use of artificial intelligence in the OODA loop, the observe, orient, decide, and act loop. So it seems that lethal and autonomous weapon systems are being used. At the same time, the war also reveals a number of enduring features, right? Political leaders blundering into very long wars that they hope to be very short, very long battle line with extended trenches that are reminiscent of the First World War. We see the critical role of information operations shaping not just the battlefield, but also the international constellation. And we see the enormous importance of attrition and thereby the mobilization of societies and economies to wage war. So there's a lot to be thinking about, but there's also something that we need to point out, that despite the fact that the war looms very large in our collective imagination of war, it is certainly not the only war raging. UCDP published its numbers 3 weeks ago, showing that 59 conflicts involving state-based armed conflicts were raging around the world. The highest number since it started collecting data in 1946. There's war in Gaza, there's war in Sudan, there's war in Myanmar. So we should not only focus on Ukraine, but acknowledge that war is a chameleon that manifests itself differently in different places around the world. Academically speaking, these wars also force us to come to grip with a number of longer-term academic debates. What do these wars imply for the long peace thesis and the purported waning of major interstate war? How do these wars reflect on discussions about war's enduring nature and its evolving character? And how do these wars inform debates about revolutions in military affairs and the balance between technology, strategy, and organization in there? Now, I think it is very topical that we're discussing that here, because it is questions such as these that force us to think about what this implies for the bachelor and master courses that we program, for the literature that we assign in these courses, what we tell our students to read, but also what types of funding we try to get for PhDs and postdocs. So at today's roundtable, we want to take stock of the ongoing recalibration of our thinking about war, and the impact it has on war studies, strategic studies, and security studies. And we basically have two guiding questions. One, what has changed in our thinking about war and warfare, and on what basis? And two, what does this mean for the academic study of war and warfare and security more generally? I'm therefore extremely pleased that we have gathered such an eminent panel here today to talk about these issues. So let me briefly introduce our panelists, and let's then kick off the discussion. With me are Isabelle Duyvesteyn. Isabelle is a professor in international studies and global history at Leiden University. She has published extensively, not just on a variety of strategic studies topics, including the forthcoming Cambridge History Strategy, not in June, but in November. But you can already order it, can you? Okay. But also on the future of strategic studies as a discipline, including in its topical scope, including a manifesto on global strategic studies. We have Janani Mohan. Janani is a PhD candidate and a Gates Cambridge Scholar at the University of Cambridge. She's researching on nuclear security policy. She's experienced working for the US government for international organizations and has assisted with monitoring nuclear energy integrity during the war in Ukraine. And Janani holds an MA in International Security from Stanford University and a BA in Political Science from UC Berkeley. And then we have Henrik Breitenbauch, who is the Dean of the Royal Danish Defense Scholar. So we really have a mix here. Henrik, who was previously the director of Center for Military Studies at the University of Copenhagen, is a leading Danish expert on defense and security policy. And he's not only published widely in strategic studies and defense planning, but he's also an advisor to NATO and to ministers at the highest level of Danish government. So I think we have a real interesting mix of contributors today. What we would like to do is the following. Each speaker is going to kick off with some reflections on these two guiding questions for about 8 minutes. And then we're going to throw the floor open, as they say in my native language, and we're going to engage our roundtable participants in a discussion. I really love this room. It's a beautiful room, but it also allows for interaction. So please, if you want to make a statement, you can make statements, but they need to be short, but preferably also ask a question. I wanted to say put your name tag up, but we don't have it. So raise your hand and the floor is yours. I would like to proceed in the following order. We first go with Isabelle, then with Henrik, and then we go to Janani. Isabelle.
Well, thank you so much. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here. Indeed, I've been given the assignment to answer 2 questions, which can be interpreted in a very elaborate sense in 8 minutes. So I've decided to share with you 2 dominant observations as a starting point for our conversation this morning. Dominant ideas about war and warfare. What does it mean for the academic study? I think the significance of war, contemporary warfare, is important in the sense that I think history matters. So that's my first point, which I want to elaborate. History is very important. And my second observation is that strategic theory, so this ties in with our field of expertise, strategic theory and key strategic insights still hold very important analytical value. And I'm going to elaborate these 2 points. So I put my cards on the table. I work at the History Institute of Leiden University. I am very engaged with teaching history. History is very important. In my perception, it's very popular to engage in historical analogy at the moment. Are we revisiting the 1930s? Is this a 19th century war? History offers us a repository of human experience to draw from for inspiration, but also to inform our thinking and possibly actions. At the start of the Ukraine war, there were very popular servicing in the press, official assessments. Ukraine was supposedly a 19th century war. Angela Merkel, former German chancellor, said that Putin was a 19th century politician. Siege warfare, such as witnessed at Bucha in March 22, was a medieval practice. Atrocity, a particular Russian feature harking back to patterns of treatment in Chechnya and Grozny in particular, but also Syria and Aleppo. While these claims show historical awareness, I think they are not correct. I would argue that the war exhibits perennial features of war that we have been confronted with since the emergence of organized violence. Throughout human history, war has revolved around territory and people. Controlling territory, controlling people on territory. Recent fashions, such as talk about postmodern war or post-territorial war with the cyber caliphate, imagines communities moving beyond a territorial focus have not stood the test of time very well. As Tim kindly mentioned, I've recently completed a large project for Cambridge University Press, the Cambridge History of Strategy, and we've tried to look at the history of strategy even before the emergence of the word. Did such a thing exist? And we see these perennial features emerging very early on. The moment that people start to converge, living in a particular territory, urbanization, people try to control territory and individuals, groups of individuals. We also see that siege warfare, another analogy I already referred to, is a common pattern. Siege, laying siege to urban centers, atrocity, a very common feature of a warfare throughout the ages. It is perennial. And in contrast to our decades-long efforts to make warfare more humane, it has always been there in history. When I look back at that large project, what did history or how did warfare and war display themselves or come to be witnessed? I want to offer you another point for consideration. So history is important, but the utilitarian framework that is so dominant in our field is an instrument to serve something, to attain something, can be complemented with a second very important perspective that has not received a lot of attention. And that is that war can be seen as an ordering exercise or a disordering exercise. So it's the process of making life for your opponent very difficult, rather than trying to attain concrete end goal or clear politically formulated end. So controlling or rather ordering or disordering is an important feature that we have seen throughout the ages. So invading a territory, creating chaos, making sure that the political system in place is no longer functioning can be seen as an important template of war. I'm moving on to my second contribution here, and that is strategic theory. I cannot help but notice, also referenced in the introduction, that scholars are very preoccupied with the importance of new technologies, technological developments. Also, perennial feature of war, new technologies, great expectations. This is going to make a difference. Expectations of cyber, AI, quantum computing, examples of drones making a lot of noise, a lot of difference in warfare in Ukraine. But what does it mean? We tend to forget a key existing insight, and that is that war is a social phenomenon. It is a product of its social context, its time and place, and the environment in which it emerges. So it would be highly surprising if the war in Ukraine had not used the drone technology that was already available before it started. So society influences war and war influences society. New technologies, game changers. We've seen it before, the emergence of the aircraft, the emergence of tanks, the emergence of nuclear weapons, and few of them live up to that expectation of making a strategic, direct, immediate strategic difference. Nuclear weapons, of course, are an exception. More often, they tend to influence tactics or operations. And closely related is another observation that I want to share with you related to technology. The learning and adaptation cycles to innovations continue to be witnessed, only the time frame is changing. So it's a key feature of war. Emerging technologies, responses are formulated, countermeasures are taken. Then you attain a culminating point of effectiveness because the opponent is a responding, thinking, reacting counterpart, and then the effectiveness is undermined. So also for strategic theory, the repository of human experiences in the past is very useful. I had another point that I wanted to share about ideas of how to project this into the future. I don't know. Yeah, 30 seconds. Okay. Okay. The idea of using key insights to project into the future, large language models. So ideas that we can use technology to create a grip. These technological developments rely on a certain dominant mode of thinking with coding. It's either 0 or 1. It's linear, it's rational, it's predicting, looking for patterns and pattern recognition. And this is also a very dominant idea of how to think about the future, but we tend to forget. And we're going to go back to Clausewitz. Always good for some food for thought. Strategy can also be seen as an art, or should be seen as an art. It is creative. It's not linear. It's not a 0 or a 1. It can be both a 0 and a 1 at the same time. The power of surprise, the power of innovation. So this is an important ingredient, I think, for our considerations to think about the consequences, both for the field and our translation into concrete actions. So thank you very much.
Super, Isabelle.
Stuck to the time.
You did, and you gave us a lot of food for thought. Let's go on to Henrik. Henrik.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you so much for inviting me to give this little talk, and I look forward to the discussion that follows. So the bottom line up front of what I'm going to say is that when we think about the future of war, it's really important to think in plural and to have a better, deliberate, explicit understanding of what it means to think about futures as such. So in other words, I'm looking to construct a relatively simple, but still hopefully useful taxonomy of futures in the plural. Sometimes when you're at a seminar, you sit and wonder, why am I here and why is this man talking to me? So let me just at least help you with the second of those two questions, namely where I'm coming from. And I come from a position that is very close to the late Colin Gray's. I think on the one hand that it's incredibly important that when we do, and I like to call this strategic studies rather than security studies normally, for this following reason, that when we do strategic studies, it's important to draw on all of the wealth and the richness of the academic traditions of the university, while on the other hand, also to be interested in actual practical reality. So the following is kind of a reflection, both on the one hand, on the academic craft of thinking about the future, and on the other hand, also to help people who make decisions about future wars, so defense planners and people who defense policy, to help them better understand the outlines of what it is that they're doing. So to help them with, in other words, with defense planning. But let me start somewhere else, perhaps surprisingly, namely with the French poet, thinker, writer, and also perhaps even philosopher, Charles Baudelaire, who in one of his writings on the critic of art notes that if indeed there is no heaven and hell, which of course you reject if you're an atheist, if there is no heaven and hell, then every conceptualization of heaven and hell that we have must be understood as something that pertains to the richness of human life between being born and being dead. So all of the imaginations we have had as humans about heaven and hell are basically, in this sense, projections about the future that are either dystopic or utopic, depending on your point of view and your preference. But the point is that these are all imaginaries. These are imaginations about the future that we then have to encapsulate into the present. There is no future. There is only the present, and then other imaginations about the future. Now, when we speak about the future of war, I think that for that reason, it's really important that we understand that it's really an act of classification. It's a matter of defining what's important and making these arguments lead to somewhere. Evidently, for decision makers, they lead to decisions about which guns to buy and which kinds of armies to raise, and for others, they lead to decisions about which kinds of peace you might work for, which might of conflict you might seek. I think we need to talk about the future because it gives us also a way of building a better form of defense planning. We have very much in the craft of defense planning a tendency to work with singular conceptions of the future. And of course, there are struggles over what these futures mean, but there's not very often a very deliberate language about how to work with a multitude of futures and explicit ones. So what I would actually like to do is just to take a very simple variant on Peter Schwartz's approach to future studies in his Art of the Long View and try to make some of these implicit things explicit. And I'm just going to give some examples, and hopefully you can help build me some better ones in this discussion. So first of all, our view of the future, when we talk about the future of war, is very often very land-centric. It's always very often some kind of war that takes place on the ground. But in fact, a lot of the money we spend on military gear is for maritime purposes, and the future of war at sea is not taking up so much of our common conscience as it perhaps could have, or especially also, of course, air warfare. So in a sense, from that starting point, we need to build systematic futures for specific stakeholders and figure out how they fit into the overall setup. We can do that both academically, but we can also do it for the purpose of the defense planners. And that would mean, first of all, to build, service-specific futures and domain-specific futures. So land warfare, air warfare, sea warfare, and so on, and build them and work with them specifically in the realm of defense planning, but also to work with them academically and figure out what is going on, who's building these futures, and so on. Of course, the moment you start building domain-specific futures, you would immediately ask yourself, why don't I build a multi-domain operations future? Because that's one of the leading themes that are out there. And you can also ask yourself, what is the overall future of war from an MOD perspective or sort of an aggregate government perspective? Which kinds of wars should we prepare for in this broad sense? So they are other kinds of stakeholders. From a small NATO nation, having a national future vision of the future of war is nonsensical, because any of the wars that, or at least wars of self-defense that my country or the Czech Republic would be fighting would be collective defense in the shape of NATO. So it matters here also to understand what is NATO's future of war, what is SHAPE or Allied Command Operations future of war. And actually here we see a convergence between the vision of the multi-domains operations, where there's a set of discourses pertaining to this technological perspective on the future of war that are kind of coalesced into the defense planning that's going on in the NATO context. And these two are kind of intertwined. They're not completely the same, but often you see language that makes them appear as if they were. Two more quick points, and then I'll stop. Another way of looking for a taxonomy is to ask, when future, and that seems nonsensical, but in effect, we work with two different kinds of futures. There's the kind of future of war that you find in The Economist nowadays, that is about learning from the battlefield in Ukraine and how does that apply to the way we're actually implementing our defense planning currently. And then there's the more far imagined future of war, which is this clean war of multi-domain operations in a fight between the United States and China, most famously, of course, depicted in the novel Ghost Fleet, with a rather clanky plot, but nevertheless put together in a way that was readable. And then finally, I think what's really important when we think about futures of war is not just to think about our futures of war, but systematically incorporate their futures of war. And if we look at this, I think entails also a methodological point, because we need to understand what is not just the Chinese, the Russian, the Iranian future of war, what their visions are, but also to understand how we go from the Chinese, Russian, Iranian way of war, what is the vector that builds towards their vision of future war, and what actually makes those trajectories go somewhere, so that we are in principle trying to get ahead of their curve in a sense. So understanding their futures of war is also important to incorporate into our defense planning. And then finally, perhaps it's important, I think, to incorporate also the understanding of where these futures are produced, by whom. And in many cases, the private sector plays a great role in propagating specific futures of war that are relatively closely connected to specific weapon systems. And that, in a sense, is nonsensical, because it also often produces a war without context. It's a war that's sub-tactical in a sense, and war is always strategic and always political. Thank you.
Thank you, Henrik. Janani, let's go.
That's good. Thank you, Tim. I think how you started this entire panel was very interesting by just starting by saying warfare is a very serious topic. It has a very serious nature to it. It has serious impact on people. And I think that's always a starting point and also kind of a concluding point on anything about security studies. It starts from that human perspective and it kind of ends with that human perspective to some degree. So I think that was a great point to make. In terms of what I want to do here today, I'm going to first talk about where I see the future of warfare as as a field broadly, and then where we can take that in terms of academic study. Because my background is nuclear, there's going to be a bit of a nuclear bias. So I'm warning everyone in advance to expect that. But before I dive into that part, I really want to talk about where in academia, but also beyond academia, we see a lot of the trends that exist in this future of warfare. So when I'm looking at this, I often think about this future of warfare with when is this future? Is it now? How far out is it? And if we think about it as starting kind of in this current context, the war in Ukraine, kind of this general escalation that is going on around the world, the COVID-19 pandemic in some ways served as this major disruptor. It was a disruptive point where there was a lot of tension, global tension beforehand. There was a bit of a brief pause, reset in some cases of tension, and then often this tension went either in just continued on afterwards or went in new directions. So since the COVID-19 pandemic, I think we've seen 5 key turning points or trends to watch in terms of how and where the future of warfare will take us. First of all, there is this nuclear escalation element, and we see that in the war in Ukraine, specifically in Russia's attacks on nuclear energy facilities and the type of rhetoric we see around nuclear use, especially the use of tactical nuclear weapons, and then also in the repositioning of nuclear weapons themselves. So for example, Russia's stationing of nuclear weapons in Belarus, but of course there is alleged stationing as well by the US recently in UK, for example. So there has been this general forward posturing in nuclear. Then beyond that, the second trend that I think we're going to end up needing to watch is this overall weakening of international norms. There are a lot of norms surrounding military necessity, proportionality, humanity, conventions against torture, the way that militaries should fight that were agreed upon, kind of stemming out of the Geneva Conventions as well as other treaties from that era. A lot of the warfare we see today goes beyond that. There are ways in which international norms can no longer be used to explain what is happening, and it has impacted the way we think about traditional escalation ladders. For example, if we look at the Tigray War in Ethiopia, the attacks in Gaza, there's a lot of ways in which the expected behavior or codes of conduct have changed in terms of what militaries will do when responding. The third trend that I think we're going to have to watch in warfare as this concept would be the way that authoritarianism and this leaning towards authoritarian structures, even within democratic countries, will end up positioning countries towards a more offensive, realist positions. And so there is a trend where as countries lean towards more power and more unconstrained power in specific country leadership, there tends to be less constraints on how country leadership interact with decision-making in terms of warfare. The fourth trend then has to deal with resource control and resource allocation. Specifically, as resources become scarcer and scarcer, how are countries going to be fighting over these resources? And although this trend is something we haven't seen necessarily as active yet in kind of large-scale conflict, we do see it in localized regional conflict already. And then this fifth trend, of course, is technology, which, as my colleague up here mentioned, there are a lot of themes that exist in our historical study that can explain our use of new technologies in warfare. And yet there's a lot that we don't understand, especially about how artificial intelligence is being brought out to the masses through things like ChatGPT, and what this means when people, the public in general, are able to interact more with forms of technology that can be very beneficial, but can also be very problematic if used incorrectly. So the reason I mentioned these 5 trends broadly before kind of diving more into this nuclear angle is because I think it situates what we need to be looking at in warfare, but also why nuclear escalation specifically has been perhaps has escalated the furthest in this brief period of time post-pandemic. When we look at the war in Ukraine specifically, I think that there are 3 ways that the war in Ukraine has changed our conceptualizing of nuclear warfare. First of all, the attacks on nuclear energy facilities as a means of ongoing warfare. This has brought this conventional element into the nuclear space. For the first time in history, during a conventional war, there's been the weaponizing of nuclear energy. And I think studying that and how that will impact our conceptualization of the space is very relevant. Second, in Ukraine, we see the stationing of nuclear weapons in Belarus. This is a period that the world is entering again, where nuclear weapon states are going to be stationing nuclear weapons in non-nuclear weapon states. But interestingly, I think Belarus is one of those interesting case samples where we see that Belarus has actually adopted some language that a nuclear weapon state would use in its own military doctrine. So for example, in the upcoming military doctrine, it apparently mentions things, because I don't think the text has been released yet, but it will mention things like how Belarus would consider using nuclear weapons to respond to increased aggression from Europe. So this blurring of lines between stationing as a concept and nuclear proliferation as a concept, I think will end up blending these two areas together as we study it from the security studies element. And then the third thing that I think that the war in Ukraine has really introduced to this nuclear security space is this tactical nuclear weapons focus. And I wouldn't say it's introduced it so much as continued it, shown a spotlight on it, but it's a very serious issue about where tactical nuclear weapons fit in a traditional escalation framework or ladder. There is this general blurring of line between conventional weapons and nuclear weapons. And as tactical nuclear weapons are, low-scale nuclear weapons with a more limited impact, how that will affect how we think about nuclear weapons and the norms surrounding nuclear nonproliferation will be something that's very interesting to look at. So the reason I mention all three of these is I think that the war in Ukraine, looking at it as kind of this isolated incident, has really moved forward some of these escalatory frameworks that we think about in terms of nuclear weapons. But more importantly, it's also very symptomatic or it's a great example of kind of this third nuclear age that we're going into. It reflects in the nuclearization of North Korea, in the US withdrawal from the JCPOA, in India's use of counterforce nuclear strategies. These are all examples of how nuclear escalation has been increasing and growing. So now I want to turn to how do we study this? How do we actually address it as scholars in this room? And I think in terms of nuclear, but also beyond nuclear, there are going to be three types of research that we need to commit to, that we need to look more into. First of all, from a nuclear perspective, we tend to rely on a lot of frameworks from the Cold War, from this first nuclear era, where we look at Cold War polarity, mutually assured destruction, Kahn's escalation ladder. So there's all of these concepts that we still rely on, these brilliant strategists during the Cold War. They came up with these ideas, we still rely on it. But I think, I would argue almost, that we need completely new frames, completely new theories for how we think about these. Specifically, we need new escalation ladders. There's a shrinking gap, as I mentioned earlier, between nuclear and conventional warfare. There are tactical nuclear weapons, there are higher impact conventional weapons. There's definitely going to need to be a new understanding of what sort of escalation merits what sort of proportionality. Second, we need new deterrence frameworks. This is obviously very relevant in the nuclear space, but also in the conventional space. I think there is a growing economic underpinning for how we think about deterrence in warfare. Specifically, economic sanctions as well as economic agreements, I think, will end up being a really important space to understand how power dynamics work between countries. And then third, we need new norms research. Norms in themselves have changed vastly in the past few years in terms of what global states as well as non-state actors have agreed upon as kind of these codes of conduct of warfare. In the nuclear space specifically, I think a very interesting question will end up being how countries outside of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty with nuclear weapons, so for example, India, Pakistan, allegedly Israel, should be addressed in the long term. I would suggest that based on the way that the world is moving in terms of global tensions, our understanding of these countries, as well as how to ensure that norms include countries outside of major international treaties, will be incredibly valuable to understanding both international law, but its impact on these codes of conduct. So new escalation ladders, new deterrence frameworks, new norms research. Those are kind of the three spaces that I would say we need to think about in terms of the future of strategic studies. And then before ending here, I also want to talk a little bit about how we conceptualize education in itself. I think history is very, very valuable. That's how we often look to the past to understand the future, to understand behavioral elements between states. But beyond that, we also need to look at new primary research. One of the reasons in the nuclear space, but also beyond, as we're looking at this future of warfare, that I think there's often a struggle to understand what direction warfare is heading is because a lot of the data that we have, a lot of this literature is grounded in trends that have been existing throughout history. And I think that's very relevant, but I think we tend to lack a lot of information that we need about where the world is currently. And a lot of that is behind, clearances. A lot of it is confidential. You would need a secret clearance to access in a specific country. But I think there's a lot of it that we could get through doing more interviews with subject matter experts, especially non-attributional interviews, to be able to gather that information. And then one final point just before I wrap up is I think that there is this very important element to how serious warfare is. And as we approach warfare, there are these new ways, and a lot of this comes out as well as through like women and security perspectives, but there are a lot of ways that we can think about the social impact of warfare and the impact that it has. And as we study it, it can be very easy to focus on theory and to focus on how theory impacts the academia that we look at. But I think there's also always going to be this very human impact in security studies that is so important to think about as we study, as we write, just think about who we're able to help with our research on some level, because I think that's how we're able to make such an important impact with what we write, what we study, what we research in academia. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Tim. Thank you.
Thank you. For three fascinating contributions that, if you think about it, feed very nicely into one another. So we start out with Isabelle, a warning for shallow historical analogies and pointing us towards the enduring features of war, in which she noticed that war can be conceptualized not only as an instrument to attain political objectives, but can also be seen as an ordering instrument or a disordering instrument. And Isabelle warns us for technocentric visions that oftentimes prevail, saying that war is a social phenomenon indeed, and war influences society and society influences war. And Henrik picks that up and in a sort of Alexander Ventian turn says war is what we make of it in the most literal sense of it. And the future is created in the minds of men and women. And that means that the future as such doesn't exist, but it's produced. And in order to understand the future, we want to focus on who are doing the producing. We can look at service-specific, domain-specific, ally-specific, and opponent-specific futures, in addition to thinking about what factors drive the visions of our opponents in order to understand how they arrive at and whether they can actually effectuate war. These are a lot of academic terms that can be thrown around at conferences such as these. And you also point out, Henrik, the risk of ending up in a future. I mean, I don't know whether you use the term risk, but ending up in a future that is produced by an industry that focuses on technology and an operational tactical level and forgets that strategic level, which goes to the heart. And then Janani, you continue, and it feeds very nicely into one another, and you essentially survey a number of trends in warfare or coercion in the way I would frame it, and assess specifically pertaining to the nuclear instrument, how coercive dynamics are changing. And what I find very interesting, and now I'm going to look around the room, and if you have an observation, please raise your hand, but I'm going to ask the participants to talk to one another, because what is very interesting is that what Janani argues is precisely because technologies are changing, we see strategic dynamics changing. And that sort of seems, I don't think it eventually does, but it sort of seems to contradict what Isabelle says, or at least there's a healthy tension there. So what I wanted to ask our participants is to talk to one another. Isabelle, I want to start out with you. You talk about, and rightly so, enduring features. At the same time, we see, as in this evolving security environment, how technologies affect strategic dynamics. How do you see that?
Well, Tim, as I said, I'm an historian. I'm not in the business of future predictions. So to rephrase your question and move it on to Henrik, because I find your observation hugely fascinating by unpacking this. I have sympathy for the idea of the multiplicity of futures But if we look at how in the past we talked about the future, we have to integrate all the elements that you unpacked. So if we talk about preparing for future war, it will be, as you said, an alliance preparation, where there will be a naval element, where you are going to project your interpretation of what the potential opponent will do or how they will prepare in your calculations of what you think the future might like. So I like your unpacking, but I think it is too detailed. So if you want to prepare for the future, you need to integrate it. So that would be my question for you. And for Janani, amazing to the force of all these elements and trends. I want to pick up on one particular issue, and it's because I worked on that myself, so please forgive me for staying close to home. But I looked at the escalation literature. That interested me very much. I share your observation that the literature on escalation is very Cold War centric. It doesn't serve a lot of our needs currently when it comes to strategic theory. So I agree, but what I noticed, and I looked in particular escalation processes between state and non-state actors, those terrorist groups, rebel forces, insurgents, and how does escalation emerge when you often start out with like very small scale problems that end up getting out of hand. And I wanted to know, how does that escalation? And then you start with the idea of an escalation ladder with a neatly stratified linear process of going up the ladder of ever increasing levels of pain to inflict on your opponent. And in reality, it doesn't fit. So my question to you is, what would you take from that Cold War literature and bring it forward in the specific domain of the nuclear?
And I get a sign from the back that we need to speak up a little.
Oh, sorry.
Isabelle, thank you for taking over and asking two fascinating questions. And please, please address them. But I would like to prod you, not on predicting the future, but as to how conceptually we then deal with the role of changes in technology vis-a-vis those enduring features. So how can we see developments in technologies that are in fact creating new dynamics, and how do they relate to enduring features of warfare, and our preparations for it? I'm going to go to Henrik first, then Janani, and then back to Isabelle. Henrik.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Isabelle. I understand your quibble with the argument, but I don't think I was arguing actually that we needed something very detailed. I think I'm rather arguing that every time you see the word future being used, it's always situated. It's always a future for someone about something that serves some kind of purpose. So I'm just trying to render explicit and give us some more methodological awareness about what it is that we do when we talk about the future of. And I think actually, if you look, it can also help us understand what role does futures play in making defense planning and defense policy decisions. So if you look at the adversaries, we can relatively quickly see that there is maybe a Chinese way of war, and we can maybe also in the literature see that there are a number of Chinese visions of future war. So they have this notion of intelligentized warfare, which I cannot pronounce, and which looks a little bit like multi-domain operations, for example. But it's also pretty clear if you look at that, does that vision of future war, so a kind of a campaign vision, compared to the Chinese way of war and the vector between those 2 points, does that represent the way we actually think how the Chinese defense policy will evolve? I don't think so. So what other factors are in play? Well, then we have to use our comparative politics brains and think about how the relationship between the defense sector and the private sector and decision makers in defense policy and so on are actually involved in defense planning. So many other things than a unified vision of there's this one future that we're all working towards. That idea evidently is wrong, but it gives us an understanding then that what is then the residual function of futures in defense planning. And I think we need, as academics, and both for our own sake, And as academics who would want to help defense planners, we need a better language for understanding the role of futures in that context.
Janani.
Thank you. So I think two interesting questions. First of all, to start off with yours, Tim. In terms of this non-historical element or way of studying emerging technology and its impact on warfare, I appreciate you asking this question because I had to run over some of it and couldn't get into quite the nuances. I just want to start by saying the historical approach is very relevant and important. So I'm not saying that it is not. I'm just saying that on top of that, the reason that I feel like between, and what I've seen actually between, because I've switched between kind of this academic hat and then also a policy hat because of my experiences working on government. So I think the reason that when, from a government perspective, from a policy creation perspective, when you look at the academic literature, you're seeing all of this very valuable understanding and analysis of historical concepts. And then part of this thinking about it in a future context comes from the government making process. You're thinking, okay, these are all of the historical literature. This is how academics have conceptualized this. It's very, very relevant. And then this is how we can futurize whatever this concept is. And I think academia can reach more into the future in some ways, admitting, of course, to the gaps in our ability to evidence this. But we can reach more into the future. And the way to do that is to at least get very current information and current data that we can use to extend these historical trends to the current stage. And because a lot of this information and evidence is behind these clearance paywalls almost, right? Like how can we break down some of those barriers? And I think non-attributional subject matter expert interviews is this like really key concept and ability to be able to talk to people within the US government, within NATO, within the European Union government to understand what is going on in terms of decision-making behind the scenes. So that's where I would extend this beyond history and be like, we need current information in an academic setting so we can use our academic frameworks and apply it to this future context. And then to respond to the question on escalation ladders from the Cold War, I think that's very interesting. I would actually love to turn this around on you afterwards and ask what your thoughts are on it, because I think it's such an important topic. But you're absolutely right. In terms of Cold War escalation ladders, we would often think about it as country or state actor A does this, so state actor B is going to do this, so state actor, A is going to do like next step. And so we do it very much in stages. Like stage one is this stage two is here. And in fact, if you think about Herman Kahn's escalation ladder, there's like some 32, 33 maybe levels on that, 44. Thank you, at 44 on the escalation ladder. And so there's like a lot of these like like small stages, and they have been broken down into like, groupings of these stages. But to be able to conceptualize that two countries are going to escalate the exact same way, or a state and a non-state actor are going to escalate the exact same way is not realistic. Often it's very cyclical. Often you will go up on an escalation ladder and then slightly down and then up again, and right? Like it's not just going to be kind of this linear process. And so I think a lot of those elements are yet to be conceptualized because we still lean back on this Cold War type of escalation framework where it was very easy to say like the US is going to do this, USSR is going to do something else. And it was a great framework at the time. And I think it's absolutely brilliant that people were able to put that together and come up with this sort of framework. But I think that it ends up relying on more of a zero-sum game than exists today, and there's a lot more complexities. For example, escalation does not just exist in a bipolar context. If there is a bipolar escalation occurring, there will be multipolar factors influencing that escalation. And so I think a lot of those concepts are yet to be included in these frameworks and could be included in the way academia frames them moving forward.
Thank you. Isabelle.
Yeah, I just want to rectify that it's not the case that I don't think war changes. Please don't use that as a takeaway from my contribution. War is a social phenomenon, and as you might be aware, there is a long-running project at Oxford University called the Changing Character of War project, and the running joke was the hardly ever changing character of war project was going on there. There was a lot of continuity every time the groups of scholars met in that context there. I think it's important to distinguish the character of war from the nature of war. I think that's a major contribution that we owe to Carl von Clausewitz. I think the character of war can change and is subject to developments. Sorry, the changing character of war is an expression of that social context in which war takes place. And the nature of war, Clausewitz assessed as being fundamentally political. And I tried to introduce in my contribution earlier a complementary vision that war is not just a utilitarian issue that is focused on attaining a political goal, but it can also be a process infused by politics without a clearly defined end goal. So indeed, war changes, the character of war changes, but the fundamental premises that have been on the table in our field for a very long time deserve and continue to deserve our careful consideration when we look at contemporary affairs.
Here. First you, and then you, and then you, and then we'll take them, and then you, and then we ask the speakers to comment. Yes.
Thank you very much, all of you. I thought this was a fascinating start of the day. And since we're talking, all of you mentioned the importance of society and humans, and the differences that are potential adversaries and the kind of different geographical interpretations of the future of war. I might throw in just one additional element that may be perhaps sounding naive, and all of you have been working on this topic for a long time know it, about the Western democratic society's kind of new, not so new, reluctance to die in war. Ever since this, war zero death concept came to war, which is in a way against the whole principle of war, and to what extent that this will play out in a future war against potential more authoritarian regimes that do not have the same kind of sensitivities.
The great Engelhard, may he rest in peace, and the willingness to fight for your countries.
I do.
Yes. Yeah. Julia.
Thank you very much.
Excuse me, sorry. And then, yeah.
See the direction. Thank you for your comments. I also have a question regarding the human centric theme that in the panel. And I wanted to touch more on the role of which was sort of brought up the different aspects of each of the particularly since, so from my perspective, I study cyber and digital technology and how that affects coercion. But my take on it is sort of that strategy and technology. The interplay. And part of it is the role of experts in shaping futures. And I'm wondering if it would be worthwhile thinking about considering the different strategic domains where the expertise lies and how that interacts with the development of law. Curious about your thoughts on this, or just generally about the role of expertise. Should we also be thinking more about the public and how public perception shape the development of strategy?
Excellent. The role of expertise and public perception in shaping policy making. Sorry. Yes.
It's a brilliant kickstart of all of the speakers. And my first background is actually in the comms studies. Therefore, I was very curious seeing how you were narrated. You said times the term war in Ukraine, times the term once was Ukrainian, but never used the term aggression, which was interesting for me just to see. So are we really in the academic area where international law is not finding and saying that we are not taking into the strategic studies the aggression, which interesting also enough brought me to one more perspective. It's never presented, but it's maybe elaborated in the Q&A now, ideological. Because if we take into consideration the nature of the war as a social construct, so the interest of the country Russia is fighting with all of us, the collective mass, being very much strategically set in their military doctrine as well as their statements. So what about that? Is it still that it is a war in Ukraine, or is it still that we have to take into consideration the approach of understanding that if the ideology shifts, perhaps we can think to break that?
Excellent. Role of ideology. And then you, sir.
Thank you. I appreciate the very provocative panel. In that spirit, I'm going to add two more provocations in response to your work. And the first goes to think about the future of the war. And it's the observation that we often see thinking about the future of the war to the stakeholders that have the most of interest. So the military thinks about the future of war, and occasionally the defense industrial complex and firms that want to get into that business and TED Talks think about the future of war. But this is a very imperfect way of imagining the future because it leaves out a whole set of other interested parties. And maybe the dystopian view of the military and some of the sellers of weapons get in the way. The second issue is, I love the conversation about nuclear and escalation, everything. Hyper rationalistic. I mean, if you look at Khan and the escalation ladders, it's essentially deductive reasoning within a hermetic bubble. And then you can kind of go back and look post hoc at events to see how they played out and whether it fits the ladder. But think about the future. Most of war, and I'd love to jump into the debate about changing character, changing nature of war, but certainly the future war isn't hyper rationalistic the way the theorists at Rand thought about in the 60s much, and even today. So the rationalism of that escalation ladder model is problematic. Thank you.
Excellent. So we have a few more minutes. So there are 4 questions / contributions. I'm sorry. I'm very sorry. The willingness to fight, the role of expertise, the role of ideology, and the role of rationality. And I would like to ask our speakers to each take 2-3 minutes to address some or more of these points. Let's start with Henrik, and then Janani, and then Isabelle.
Thank you. Let me start with the escalation ladder then, because I think definitely I agree that you're right that Khan was wrong. It's not a ladder. It's a staircase down to a dark basement that you can stumble down on if you're drunk enough. So the image is basically wrong. No, let me speak most, I think, of expertise. Again, my mission today was to create awareness about the role of the creation of futures, and I think both the creation of futures in official contexts, in official documents, and the way they underpin decisions, but also the role that academics can play in creating and sustaining futures and awareness about futures as such, and not just the futures that are official, but also ones that maybe have a more popular character. And I think the imaginaries about the public imaginaries about the future of war are very strong. Most of the movies that we go see, and if we watch Netflix, it's all about war. So there's tons and tons and tons of imaginaries of war that we all share and have, not just as academics, but as private viewers. But I think as academics, we have a specific obligation to think and understand the role of futures from a methodological point. And this is actually where I wanted to touch upon something that Isabelle said, which is about the use of history. And I think if you look at this from a foresight perspective, you have this notion in the discipline of foresight. You have this notion that you can use backcasting to basically systematically use history as a way of understanding the future. So you have language there that's useful. And just I think this is really important from a political science perspective. I think we spend far too much time in the graduate programs learning nowadays mixed methods and quantitative approaches that lead us nowhere. I think we should replace at least some of this with an understanding, with a quest for understanding how decision makers actually make decisions, and be interested in the ways they use analysis, including systematic analysis that go into futures for the decisions, because that's also an access point for us to help shape the way that they're thinking. But without an understanding of the methodology of foresight, which should take up a much bigger space in our graduate programs than mixed methods, then we will not get there. We will not be able to speak to them because we don't have the tools to speak to them. Two worlds will grow too much apart.
Thank you, Henrik, and thank you also for finally answering my second question, what this means for how we study and teach security studies, strategic studies, war studies.
Yeah. So I'm going to very quickly try to get through all 4 questions. So apologies in advance if it sounds like I'm running through a few concepts here. I think willingness to fight is a very interesting topic. It's something that I have not worked on before, but I would really enjoy looking more into that space, because I think specifically the direction that academia, but also just our studies more broadly, are going to have to go are into how functional and how the futurization of autonomous, that like whether it's autonomous drones, but just autonomous warfare more broadly will look. Because as Western countries, and specifically when I say Western countries, I'm thinking the US, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, Western Europe, like these countries, how there's been like this very large diminishing in our ability to look at like in our ability to send people to war and actually like want to avoid casualties, I think will really change the dynamics. So I think autonomous, like studying on autonomous systems is where that's going. Quickly about expertise, I think that the one thing we can take away from academia when thinking about expertise is that peer review is an incredible process. And so if we think about peer review and we try to apply that in a policy setting, it would be great if we were able to do that almost to be like, well, is there evidence for this? How are we thinking about this? Do people agree? I think that could be something we can take away from academia and learn from it in a broader setting. Quickly about ideology, I think it's interesting how you said, is this a war in Ukraine or a war beyond Ukraine? There's so many terminology points in academia that we tend to use phrases that are very commonly used without necessarily thinking about the nuance of how we phrase that. So I think it's almost a language question, and I think it's something that as academics, we need to be very responsible with what sort of language we're using. I know that's not a very specific answer, but that's what I kind of took away from your comment. I think it's a really valuable point. And then about escalation ladders, you're absolutely correct. I think hyper-rationality is perhaps this legacy of the Cold War era, and that's one way we can look at those systems that come out of that space. As we're looking at the future, we need to be aware that there's less and less rationality to some extent, but also we need to think about how can we conceptualize this. As an academic, I think our fundamental role is to think about how can we create theories, frameworks, understanding of the world around us. And so even if that's beyond rationality, even if there's like this growing element of irrationality, understanding how we can conceptualize irrationality is going to be part of our framing and our job. And I think we can learn a lot from these escalation ladders that have existed previously, obviously updating it to be able to properly conceptualize how the world is not necessarily as, as stepwise as it could have been, perhaps. Arguably, I would say it's also arguable that that was the context in the past, but as in that type of stage-wise process. And then, sorry, over to you as well.
Thank you. Isabelle.
I'll be really brief. So the reluctance to die has been investigated, and there is evidence that it depends on the issue at hand. So if it's depending on fighting for your homeland, the reluctance to die decreases. People are willing to suffer for some particular issues and not for others. So we know a bit about how that works. In regards to the role of expertise, thank you, Julia, for the question. I have a different take from my neighbors. Historically, again, we are not very good at predicting the future. We've missed the end of the Cold War, COVID, the financial crisis, 9/11. So yeah, we need more expertise, but we need it to be grounded in good research. So we need all of you to work hard to help us get a better grip and a better understanding on these matters. In regards to the escalation ladder, very sympathetic to your comment. I disagree slightly with Janani. I think it is not about less rationality, but it's situated rationality. So I do think people act in a rational manner, but we don't have all the information that they're ready to fully understand their rationality. And that ties in with the question about ideology. It's situated. So it depends on where you come from, what your history is, what the past dependency is, in order to fully grasp what the world looks like from that particular angle. And words and language matter greatly. So thank you for that contribution.
Okay, thank you all. It's 11 o'clock now. Nicola, so I think we should move on to the next panel. So I'm very sorry, and I hope to discuss this during the break. It's not up to me to give a whole summary now. So the only image that I wanted to leave you with is somehow our discussion centered around that escalation ladder, or touched upon it many times. And Henrik left us with that image of not a straightforward ladder, but more a stairways that you stumble upon descending into a dark basement. And I think it is up to all of us as a multidisciplinary school, purity studies, strategic studies, and war studies, to shed more light on that very dark stairway. Thank you very much. Enjoy the conference.